A young single mother is kicked out of a restaurant for having her baby with her, until a millionaire buys the place and invites her back as owner. The elegant New York restaurant was crowded on that cold night. Couples laughed, glasses clinked, and waiters glided between the tables like rehearsed shadows. In the corner, a young mother tried to soothe the soft cries of her baby wrapped in a worn blanket. With each sob from the little one, eyes pierced her like invisible blades, expressions of disgust, venomous whispers, gestures of impatience. The manager approached with a cold smile and sharp words, asking her to leave. The mother begged, saying she only wanted to finish the soup she had ordered with the little money she had, but she was pushed out in front of everyone, baby in her arms, amidst muffled laughter and triumphant looks from the wealthy diners. The door closed behind her with a cruel click, leaving her outside in the snow, as if unworthy of even human warmth. Hours later, a luxury black car pulled up in front of the same restaurant. A tall man emerged, with a firm gaze and an imposing presence. Silence fell over the room when he entered. Everyone recognized that face, one of the most influential and feared businessmen in the country. Without looking at anyone, he asked to speak to the manager. His words were few, but each syllable fell like a sentence. "From today on, this place is mine." Murmurs of shock spread among the diners. The millionaire walked to the same table where the young mother had been humiliated, and without raising his voice ordered an extra chair to be brought. Minutes later, the door opened, and to everyone's astonishment, the young mother was invited back in, not as a rejected customer, but as the future owner of the restaurant. Justice, silent and unexpected, began to unfold before everyone's incredulous eyes. The night's chill enveloped New York like a heavy veil, and the restaurant's golden lights illuminated the sidewalk, as if promising warmth and exclusivity reserved for a select few. Inside, the ambiance was a spectacle in itself. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant reflections over impeccably set tables, with white tablecloths resembling royal linens, gleaming glasses, and plates arranged like works of art. Men in expensive suits conversed in low tones, displaying watches that cost more than many families' annual rent, while women in sophisticated dresses exchanged practiced smiles that concealed silent rivalries. Everything there reeked of power, ostentation, and an invisible barrier separating those who belonged in that space from those who dared to defy the rules of appearance and status. Outside, the icy street was another world, where the wind bit the skin and horns honked, reminding us that life continued indifferently to the glitter of the shop windows. It was into this contrast that she appeared, holding a baby wrapped in a worn blanket, her hair hastily tied back, and a simple coat that betrayed both her haste and her lack of resources. Her eyes, though tired, held a quiet determination that contrasted with the vulnerability of her presence before that temple of luxury. Upon entering, she immediately felt the weight of the gazes that roamed her figure, like someone assessing a paint error on a flawless wall. The baby's soft cry seeped into the air of crystal and polite conversation, breaking the rehearsed scene like an off-key note in a symphony. With each sob from the little one, an invisible wave of irritation could be felt. Glances met, heads shook in disapproval. Still, she took a deep breath and walked to a table in the corner, ordering only a cheap soup, enough to warm her body and hold her son in her arms, while she tried to believe that she, too, had a right to be there, even if only for one night. The waiter hesitated before taking her order, his appraising, almost pitying look betraying that he'd already imagined what would happen next. Deep down, this place had its own unwritten laws. No matter what the menu said, some people simply weren't welcome. And with each passing minute, the tension grew like invisible smoke. A nearby couple muttered harsh words, another woman rolled her eyes, and the sound of her spoon hitting the porcelain seemed louder than it should have, as if the entire restaurant were conspiring to push her back out into the street. But she, though embarrassed, held the baby tightly and stared at the soup before her as if grasping for a last shred of dignity, unaware that amidst that sea of hostile gazes, there was another pair of eyes observing her silently, yet to reveal their intentions. Her past was a mosaic of scars, fragments of pain, and memories that never quite fit together, like a puzzle lost in time. Born in a neighborhood forgotten by the great maps, she grew up amid dark streets, where the sound of sirens was more constant than the laughter of children, and the future seemed forever postponed to a tomorrow that never came. Her father had disappeared early, driven by addiction and violence, leaving behind only broken promises and an absence that hurt most on days when the cold crept through the cracks of the poorly maintained house. Her mother, overwhelmed, did what she could, but life consumed her too quickly, leaving her daughter the legacy of a solitary struggle. She learned early that silence was a form of protection, that crying didn't bring bread to the table, and that the only way out was to keep walking, even when her feet bled. When adolescence arrived, she brought with her the illusions of youth. She believed in the first man who promised her the world in a few words, a world that never existed. He left as soon as he learned of her pregnancy, leaving her with a growing belly and a broken heart. While other young women planned trips, studies, or parties, she counted coins for diapers and prayed her son wouldn't feel the hunger she herself had so often felt. The nights were long, marked by the echo of tired footsteps in the narrow hallway of the small rented apartment, where the makeshift crib took up almost all the space. Jobs came and went, low-paying jobs, endless hours in fast food restaurants, looks of contempt from customers who never imagined this exhausted girl in her wrinkled uniform could have dreams as big as theirs. Still, she refused to give up. The baby was her strength, the only spark of hope that kept her going when everything around her seemed to be pushing her to the ground. In her most desperate days, she remembered her mother's words, "No one can take your dignity from you unless you give it to her yourself." And it was this dignity, even if wounded, that made her hold her head high amid the world's silent humiliations. When she arrived at the restaurant that night, she carried not only her son in her arms, but the entire weight of a life that seemed to scream against her. The cold of the street was nothing compared to the cold she had so often felt inside. Every scornful look, every closed door, every broken promise echoed in her mind, as if the entire universe were testing the resilience of her soul. She knew she was not welcome in places like that, but she also knew that if she didn't fight, her son would grow up believing there were places he could never enter, and that, to her, was unacceptable. Inside the restaurant, the buzz of conversation seemed to grow stronger as eyes increasingly focused on the young mother. The restless baby cried softly, each sound echoing as if an affront to the exquisite silence of the place. A group of men at a nearby table, dressed in impeccable suits, laughed loudly at private jokes, but soon found a new source of amusement, her presence. One of them, a well-known heir to a wealthy family, leaned over to his friends and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Place your bets, gentlemen. How long until the manager has the courage to throw this intruder out? 10 minutes? 15? Laughter spread, complicit, while looks of approval reinforced the cruel game unfolding. Another, more daring, raised his hand and summoned the waiter, leaving a few generous bills on the table. "Here's your tip in advance for when you get rid of the problem," she said with a disdainful smile, as if she were talking about something dirty, uncomfortable, unworthy of being there. The scene became a silent spectacle. Customers stopped eating, watching as if watching a play where the humiliation of others was the main plot. The young woman, feeling the eyes boring into her skin, tried to hide her embarrassment, caressing the baby with trembling hands and whispering words of comfort. Deep down, however, she knew a storm was approaching. The manager, pressured by the customers' stares and the shameless bets placed, walked to the table with a forced smile that didn't hide the coldness in her eyes. Her every step sounded like a warning, each click of her heels on the marble. Floor increased the weight of the silence around her. Upon arriving, she bowed slightly, as if a friend offering advice, but her words were sharp. "Ma'am, this is not an appropriate environment for children. We've received complaints, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her heart raced, her face burned, and for a moment she considered getting up immediately and fleeing to avoid prolonging this ordeal. But when she looked at the baby, who was staring at her with eyes still wet with tears, something inside her screamed that she couldn't simply accept it. She tried to argue, her voice breaking. "Please, I paid for the food. I only need a few minutes to finish. It's very cold outside." But her plea was met with renewed laughter from the men's table, and someone commented loudly, "Look, not only are you poor, but you're stubborn." The collective laughter exploded, fueling the cruelty. She felt her throat tighten, as if the walls of the place were closing in on her. The baby cried again, and this was the perfect excuse for the manager, now out of patience, to pick up the still half-eaten plate and whisk it away without ceremony. "I'm sorry, but we can't have this kind of situation in here," she said, lifting her chin as if defending the restaurant's honor. The silence that followed was only interrupted by a sarcastic applause from the table of gamblers, celebrating the end of the bet. The young woman, swallowing the tears burning in her throat, struggled to her feet, holding the baby tightly and trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. She walked to the exit under the cold gaze of those present, and each step seemed to echo like a verdict. She didn't belong in this world. When the door closed behind her, the cold street was almost a relief, even though inside her absence was toasted with glasses raised in mockery. The restaurant door opened, the cold night wind bringing with it a draught that made the candles on the tables tremble. The millionaire entered with firm steps, the sound of his shoes echoing on the marble like a melody of authority. The diners recognized him immediately. Whispers spread, some faces lit up with admiration, others with silent reverence. He didn't need to announce who he was. His presence spoke for itself. A man whose fortune and power had already graced magazine covers, the owner of companies that shaped the city's market. His eyes scanned the room with calculated calm, and for a moment, everyone believed he was simply there for dinner, until his gaze fixed on the empty chair in the corner, the same one from which the young mother had been thrown hours earlier. The silence became almost suffocating as he walked toward it. He discreetly called for the manager, but his voice, though low, carried throughout the room. He asked for details of what had happened earlier, and the hesitation on the manager's face was answer enough. With a curt gesture, he demanded that the young woman be fetched. Immediately. "She'll be back," he said, every syllable like an irrevocable order. Minutes later, when the door opened again, it was she who entered, still with the baby sleeping in her arms, her face etched with the night's chill and recent shame. For a moment she thought they were mocking her again, but the man's firm gaze stopped her in her tracks. He extended his hand, as if offering a silent pact, and said simply, "Sit down." People held their breath in disbelief at the contrast. She hesitantly looked around and felt the weight of their gazes even stronger than before, this time not of contempt, but of confusion and expectation. When she sat down, the waiter brought back the bowl of soup, this time steaming and served with ceremonial care. The millionaire remained silent, simply watching her eat amidst the environment that minutes before had rejected her. The baby stirred, and the soft cry broke the silence again, but this time no one dared react with anger. There was something in his presence that commanded respect, that silenced cruelty, and transformed contempt into embarrassed silence. It was there, in that first contact, that two opposing worlds collided. She, still in disbelief, tried to understand who this man was and why he cared for someone like her. He, with his eyes fixed on her and the child, saw something no one else could. A quiet strength hidden beneath fragility, a dignity that not even the cruelest humiliation could erase. The entire room seemed to vibrate in silence when she finally sat down across from him, as if the mere act of reoccupying that chair were an affront to the invisible laws that governed the space. People, who moments before had been laughing and toasting, now watched with looks that mixed curiosity, repulsion, and indignation. It was as if the young mother had committed a crime by returning, as if she were usurping a place that would never belong to her. The millionaire, however, said nothing. He simply remained there, his arms resting on the table, with a firm gaze that seemed to guard her every move. But the collective discomfort soon turned to active contempt. The same group of men who had initiated the bet earlier laughed again, this time even louder, as if challenging the authority of this powerful man. One of them, full of arrogance, raised his glass and declared, "It is truly inspiring to see charity in action, but this restaurant is no shelter." Laughter exploded around the table, cutting through the silence like blades. The young mother felt her face burn with shame, as if each laugh were a stone thrown at her. She clutched the baby in her arms, trying to protect him not only from the cold, but from the cruelty of the world. The millionaire remained still, but his eyes narrowed slightly, a sign that something was stirring within him. Still, she let the spectacle continue for a few moments, as if waiting for everyone to reveal their masks. A woman in an expensive red dress leaned over her table and commented loudly, "That child's crying is ruining our evening. Frankly, I don't understand why you allow this here." Others agreed with discreet nods, and soon the atmosphere became a current of silent disapproval against her. The humiliation affected not only the mother but also her son, reduced to symbols of discomfort in a place that prided itself on its perfection. The manager, now even more nervous, approached with unsteady steps and tried to intervene as if she could control the situation. "Sir, perhaps it's not appropriate." But the sentence died on her lips before the millionaire's cold gaze, which made her retreat immediately. The young woman in the midst of all this felt naked, as if her entire history were being exposed before strangers who judged her without knowing a single detail of her life. The baby whimpered again, and that was the straw that ignited the whispers at every table, words like inadequate, poor thing, and shame circulating like poison in the air. She wanted to disappear, vanish with her son in her arms, but something inside her screamed for resistance. Still, tears were already welling in her eyes, threatening to break through the wall of strength she had built. The humiliation was not just public, it was collective, as if everyone present needed confirmation that she had no right to be there, and each look of contempt was heavier than the cold of the street he had left behind. The millionaire, until then silent, leaned forward slightly, and his deep voice broke through the room like a suppressed thunder. Interesting to see how true poverty isn't out there, but sitting at the table of people who have never known the value of dignity. Silence returned in a snap, and for the first time eyes turned not on her but on him, still unable to fully comprehend that the spectacle of humiliation was about to turn against the spectators themselves. The silence after the millionaire's words seemed to weigh down the room, but it was broken when she unexpectedly raised her face. Until that moment, the young mother had remained almost motionless, bearing every look, every word, like someone carrying stones in silence. But now her eyes shone with something that wasn't just pain. There was firmness, there was awareness. Holding the baby with one arm, she rested the other on the table, and for the first time, let her voice escape clearly enough for all to hear. "Don't think I didn't know what was happening," she said, each syllable cutting through the air like a blade. The customers looked at each other in confusion. I heard every laugh, every bet, every word thrown at me and my son. I heard them turn our presence into a spectacle when they played with our dignity as if it were cards at a gaming table. Expressions changed. Some looked away, others frowned, as if they hadn't expected this woman to have the courage to stand up to the entire room. But she continued, and her voice, though choked, carried a strength that seemed impossible given its apparent fragility. "I spent my whole life hearing that I had no place anywhere, that I should settle for little, that my destiny was written in poverty and abandonment. But no, I knew that would happen here too. I knew that the rich world cannot tolerate seeing the truth up close. A mother trying to protect her child, without a mask, without disguise, with nothing to hide." The baby stirred in her arms, and the gesture further reinforced the image of resistance. The entire room seemed to shrink, and for the first time, the discomfort fell not on her but on the spectators who, without realizing it, had become complicit in collective violence. The millionaire watched her silently, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the outer layer of his speech. He understood that those words weren't just a rant, but a revelation. She'd known from the beginning that she was exposed to judgment, that every step inside that restaurant would be a calculated risk, but she'd decided to face it anyway. "I knew everything," she repeated, now more quietly, but with even more weight. "And yet I stayed. Because if I'd left with my head down, my son would grow up believing he has no place in this world either, and I won't allow that." There was absolute silence after that, no laughter, No comment. Only the distant sound of silverware being placed on plates and the pent-up breathing of those present. The manager, who had previously seemed haughty, now hid behind the counter, as if unwilling to be part of the scene. And it was at that moment that the millionaire leaned forward slightly, recognizing that before him was not just a humiliated woman, but someone who carried a strength no amount of money could buy. The millionaire remained silent after hearing every word, his eyes fixed on the woman who, amidst her embarrassment, had revealed an unexpected strength. There was something in her voice that seemed strangely familiar, a distant echo of a memory he couldn't immediately place. The baby stirred again, and when the child turned her face, a small mark on her cheek caught his attention. A discreet but unmistakable birthmark. The man's heart raced, and for a few seconds everything around him seemed blurry, as if the restaurant, the glances, and the luxury had disappeared, leaving only the mother and child. He knew that mark. He remembered an episode from the past, an accident in a poor neighborhood years ago, when his own company had been responsible for laying off dozens of employees in an aggressive expansion. Among the names was that of a young woman, pregnant at the time, who had written a desperate letter begging for reconsideration. He had never read that letter. It was just another document lost among reports and contracts, but he remembered the process, the cold dismissal, the decision made without even looking at the affected faces. Now, before him, was the living consequence of that choice. The baby in that woman's arms bore the scar his neglect had helped to deepen, but that wasn't all. Looking at her again, the features of her face awakened even more painful memories. He realized that the young mother was the daughter of a man who had once worked for his family, a loyal employee who had lost everything when an unfair business decision had been made by his own father. It was as if life were exacting, in front of everyone, an old debt he had never known existed. The pieces fell into place cruelly. This woman wasn't just a stranger humiliated by arrogant clients. She was the unwitting heir to the consequences of an empire built on choices that crushed ordinary people. He felt a weight on his chest, a mixture of shame, guilt, and a sudden respect he couldn't hide. The revelation hit him like a silent blow, and the certainty became clear. That young mother was not there by chance. It was as if fate had prepared an inevitable encounter, a confrontation between power and fragility, between constructed wealth and surviving dignity. The millionaire lowered his gaze for a moment, and this gesture, though discreet, was noticed by everyone. For the first time in a long time, he was not the figure of absolute authority in the room, but someone facing the truth of his own actions, reflected in a pair of tired but unwavering eyes. The morning after the incident at the restaurant, she didn't return. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling every detail of his life, found her immediate absence strange. He sent employees to discreetly search for information, but they found nothing beyond an old address and overdue bills that revealed a life constantly on the run. Days passed, and the empty chair in that corner of the restaurant seemed to haunt him like a shadow. He would go there at night, sitting alone, and every detail of the space brought back memories of her. The firm gaze that withstood the mockery, the choked but unbreakable voice, and above all the baby, whose birthmark now throbbed in his mind as a symbol of a truth he could no longer ignore. Customers noticed his restlessness. That man, once untouchable and impenetrable, seemed to have lost some of his usual toughness. At meetings, his mind wandered. At parties, the smiles no longer appeared. He searched for her without admitting it, reviewing old documents, silently cross-referencing information, as if trying to sew together the threads of a life. That wasn't his. As her absence continued, the weight of guilt grew, not just for the humiliation he'd witnessed, but for everything he'd learned about her past, the connections between his fortune and her family's wounds. For the first time, he felt wealth as a current, not as power. The young woman's silence was more eloquent than any words. She had disappeared without demanding anything, without seeking revenge, without asking for favors. She had simply vanished, as if she didn't want to be part of that world, as if her dignity were greater than any offer that could come from it. And this absence began to wound deeper than all the criticism, all the business defeats he'd ever faced. He found himself wondering where she was, if the baby was fed, if the cold of the nights wasn't consuming her. And in these questions, he discovered an uncomfortable truth. It wasn't just worry. It was lack. The luxurious life, once full of excess, now felt empty without the presence of that simple woman who, in just a few hours, had challenged the collective pride of an entire restaurant and exposed the hidden fragility of an empire. And it was in this absence that he began to understand that something inside him could no longer be the same. Her absence unexpectedly became a constant presence in the news. The incident at the restaurant, discreetly recorded by a customer on his cell phone, began circulating on social media. The images clearly showed the stark contrast, a young mother being thrown out amidst the laughter of wealthy customers, followed by the millionaire's imposing entrance, buying the silence with a few words. But the video, ruthlessly edited online, spared no one. It showed her distant expression as she was humiliated, showed the men toasting with contempt, showed the child crying amid the suffocating luxury. The repercussion was immediate. Headlines appeared in the next day's newspapers. The true face of the elite, luxury restaurant throws out single mother with, "Baby, millionaire buys silence but not dignity." Thousands commented online, some condemning the customers, others pointing the finger directly at him, accusing him of complicity for not having prevented the humiliation from the beginning. The empire he had built began to suffer. Brands associated with his name were boycotted. Investors questioned whether it was still worth maintaining agreements with someone publicly exposed in a scene of cruelty. Social judgment came not only from anonymous sources but also from the press and business rivals who now took advantage of the opportunity to expose old wounds. His image, once impeccable, was now tarnished by a scandal that couldn't be resolved with money. At public events, reporters surrounded him with sharp questions. "Did you know who she was? Why didn't you intervene sooner? Is it true that your company has harmed her family?" Every silence, every averted glance, became fuel for new accusations. Deep within, he felt the weight not only of the criticism, but of the truth he had discovered. This woman carried in her blood and scars the consequences of mistakes made by her world, by the power he had inherited and helped to expand. For the first time, the millionaire experienced the downfall that is not measured in numbers, but in lost respect. Society, which had previously applauded him for his achievements, now judged him in public, and none of her responses seemed enough to silence the collective outcry. Her absence, coupled with the dignified silence with which she had disappeared, made everything even crueler. While he was swallowed up by headlines and judgments, she didn't need to say anything. The world had already understood which side held the truth. The public downfall not only damaged his reputation, but opened cracks he had never dared admit before. The millionaire, accustomed to dictating the rules of the game, suddenly found himself a prisoner of an invisible court where no amount of money could defend himself. The criticism was relentless. Each article, each comment, was like a sentence forcing him to revisit not just that night, but his entire trajectory. For the first time, he began to see the trail of people forgotten in his rise, employees fired without warning, families destroyed by decisions made in cold meetings, invisible lives that were the foundation of his empire. And at the center of it all was the memory of that woman, the young mother who, with a firm gaze and a baby in her arms, had exposed her own fragility to the world. He began to change silently. The lavish parties no longer held his interest. The superficial conversations of those in power rang hollow. He began to visit the poor neighborhoods he had previously known only through reports, walking among narrow streets and weathered houses. I watched children playing in vacant lots, exhausted mothers balancing bags and responsibilities, men searching for jobs that never came. And each scene seemed like a mirror of her life, a reflection of what she'd ignored for years. In the solitude of her penthouse, she began writing in a notebook, recording memories and thoughts she'd never have the courage to share publicly. Words of regret, silent confessions, promises of change. The days became an exercise in internal reconstruction. He read old letters from laid-off employees, reviewed contracts, and tried to repair the damage, not as a businessman, but as a man trying to reclaim his own humanity. But nothing, absolutely nothing, filled the void her absence had left. The image of the baby sleeping in his arms haunted him, and in every childish glance he met on the street, he saw the subtle mark that connected him to the past and to the mistake. The transformation didn't happen with speeches, but with small, consistent gestures. He began quietly funding shelters, discreetly visiting hospitals, helping anonymous people without ever revealing his name. And yet, I knew it wasn't enough. His soul cried out not just for social redemption, but for inner forgiveness, and that could only come from her. With each passing day, the certainty grew within him. All the power, all the money, all the achievements were worthless if he couldn't look that woman in the eye again and show her that he had changed, not for convenience, but because she had planted in him the seed of a humanity he believed was lost. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious room, nor in a restaurant with chandeliers and sparkling glasses. It took place in a simple, almost forgotten space, where the smell of strong coffee and warm bread mingled with the sound of children playing in a makeshift corner. He found her in a small community center, a place where single mothers gathered to share stories, swap baby clothes, and offer support. The millionaire entered without security, without an expensive suit, wearing discreet clothes that didn't betray his status. His heart was pounding, but his gaze was steady. He knew that this moment couldn't be guided by the pride that had always accompanied him, but by the humility he had been learning to cultivate. She was sitting in a plastic chair, laughing softly as she cradled her son in her lap, the same child who had visited him so many nights in memories. Upon noticing his presence, her laughter ceased, and her eyes narrowed suspiciously. The silence between them was heavy, but also full of meaning. For a few seconds, no one around realized the intensity of that encounter, until she, without raising her voice, simply said, "You found me." He took a deep breath as if carrying the weight of 1,000 apologies too heavy for words, and replied, "I never stopped searching." Her eyes, hardened by life, didn't soften immediately. There was hurt. There was the memory of collective contempt. There were open wounds from the past he represented. But there was also a spark of curiosity, as if wanting to understand the depth of the transformation he was trying to demonstrate. He approached slowly, asking permission with his gaze before sitting down across from her. The baby, now older, looked at him with disarming innocence, and in that instant, the millionaire felt his throat close, overcome by an emotion he had never experienced before. There were no cameras, no audience, just two worlds colliding again, but this time on neutral ground, where there was no luxury of disguising truths. He began to speak, not with the firm voice of one commanding, but with the vulnerable tone of one pleading. He told her about the changes he'd been trying to make, about the silent visits to places he'd never set foot in before, about the sleepless nights he'd spent mentally replaying every detail of that night in the restaurant. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask to be seen as a hero. He asked only for the chance to show he was no longer the same man. She listened silently, her gaze fixed on him, weighing each word like someone weighing promises against scars. When she finally responded, it wasn't gently, but with a cutting honesty. "Words are beautiful, but I've learned that only gestures endure." He nodded, accepting the sentence like someone receiving a burden they're willing to bear. In that reunion, there was no immediate forgiveness, no magical reconciliation. There was, rather, the first step on a long road, marked by the naked truth of two beings who met not by chance, but because destiny demanded they look at each other again, without masks, without an audience, without excuses. Their reunion had left its mark on their silence, but now the moment had come when no words from him would be enough, only her decision. The following days were a cruel test for the millionaire. He sought her out discreetly, not to pressure her, but to be close, like someone awaiting a judgment that could change their destiny. When she finally agreed to meet him again, it was in a simple park at dusk, where mothers took their children to play. The baby, now more awake, laughed at the sight of pigeons taking flight, and this innocence contrasted with the weight of the upcoming conversation. She didn't smile. Her eyes were steady, as always, but there was a different calm, the calm of someone carrying a decision already made. He, vulnerable, spoke first. He said he was willing to give up business, to completely change his way of life, that he had already begun to repair the damage, but that none of it made sense. Without the chance to be present in her life and the child's. But she interrupted him, with a serenity that hurt more than her fury. "You don't understand. I never wanted your money nor your name. I wanted respect. I wanted my son to exist somewhere without being treated like a mistake." He tried to move closer, but she held up her hand, asking for distance. "I believe you've changed. I saw it in your eyes. I saw it in the way you speak now. But my life cannot be built on the ruins of your guilt. I need to walk my path free with my son, not as a living reminder of the mistakes of your world, but as proof that we can succeed even without him." The cold wind passed between them, carrying with it the last chances of a future together. He lowered his head, his trembling hands revealing a man who had never felt powerlessness so closely. She, in turn, walked to her son, took him in her arms, and hugged him tightly. Before leaving, she turned one last time. Her eyes, firm but tearful, met his, and the final sentence was delivered in a low voice. "I've already given you forgiveness because without it, I wouldn't have peace. But the future, that doesn't belong to you." And then she departed, leaving him standing there with the feeling that all the transformation he'd experienced hadn't been in vain, but that the greatest proof of change was accepting her decision without trying to challenge it. Poetic justice wasn't in winning her over, but in learning that some wounds aren't healed with power, only with the humility to respect the other person's choice. Snow fell softly over New York City that silent night. The nearly empty park reflected the faint glow of streetlights in frozen puddles. The millionaire walked alone, hands in his pockets, his steps slow as if each movement weighed more than the last. In the distance, he saw a scene that made him stop. A young mother, sitting on a simple wooden bench, holding her sleeping son against her chest. Her coat was thin, but her embrace was enough to warm him. She didn't see him, and he didn't dare approach. He stood a few feet away, watching in silence. In that moment, he realized that his entire life had been spent chasing achievements to be seen, to be remembered, while this woman, with nothing but dignity and courage, carried a far greater legacy. A bird landed on the bench beside her, shaking its snow-wet wings, and the contrast between the fragility of the scene and her invisible strength struck him. He smiled, a sad but sincere smile, and took a step back, then another. He turned and walked away unnoticed, leaving only the soft sound of his footsteps disappearing into the snow. The imaginary camera would pull back, revealing two worlds coexisting. She, a symbol of silent resistance, and he, a shadow who had finally learned to respect distance. No words, no reconciliation, just the weight of a preordained fate and the silent poetry of a justice that needs no explanation. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.